This meeting is being recorded.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Veronica Hood. I'm the scientific director at the Dravet Syndrome Foundation. This is part 2 of a 3-part webinar series that DSF has been helping to run, focused on some of the issues around transition and changes as individuals with Dravet syndrome reach adulthood. It's my pleasure to introduce Brian McSpadden Gardener. He has been helping to lead the efforts on a community survey that we ran last summer, trying to understand where families in the community are and how they're feeling about a lot of these issues. And now in this webinar series, Brian has been kind enough to present back to the community what everyone told us, and then to help lead discussion with caregivers about how they've overcome some of these issues and what some of the roadblocks are that families are up against. So with that, I will hand it over to you, Brian.
Great. Thank you very much, Veronica, for that introduction. And I'm just going to go ahead and share my screen here and pull up the slides. So this is a moderated discussion around the path to adulthood for Dravet patients. And it's one of 3 moderated discussions that we're presenting on topics related to that all-important transition. We know that as patients with Dravet age, there are 2 main transition points as they get into adulthood. The first occurs around 18 to 21 years of age, when there's a shift from the pediatric to adult medical caregivers, and they move out of the public education into community programming supports. There's another later transition that happens in the long term, and that's a situation-dependent transition in later adulthood, where there's a shift towards increasing involvement of non-family members in their care and a shift away from parent-centered care. Our first discussion, which is on the web, and you can download that at the Dravet Syndrome Foundation site, dealt with post-secondary programming and services. Today, we'll be talking about housing requirements and options for adults with Dravet syndrome. We want to begin this webinar by considering some relevant survey results that establish a baseline of our community understanding and opinions that exist within our community about housing and that initial and that later transition. So the survey was run in the spring of 2022. It was an online survey given to several hundred adult caregivers. The distribution of the respondents covered the standard range of ages as well as expressions of the Dravet syndrome. We had some respondents who had nonverbal patients that had feeding tubes, and on the other end, caregivers who were responding with patients that had fewer than 1 seizure a year. So it really does encompass the whole breadth of the community. Within that respondent group, though, there was a high level of uncertainty and anxiety expressed about these adult transitions. And with regards to today's topic, it's relevant to point out that 20 to 40% of those who were responding said that they were unsure about each housing question. So let's show some of the results that I think will help stimulate the discussion here. First, with regards to the timing of the transition, we asked caregivers that ranged in age from younger to older parents, how long do they expect it will be between now and when they're going to have to change the housing situation for their Dravet patient. And what we saw is that as the parents aged, which is going here from left to right, that you got 2 periods when uncertainty was greatest. One is around that initial transition around 18 to 20 years old. And then the other as the parents age and get into their later 60s and beyond, when the patients are in their 30s and beyond. When asked how satisfied you are with the housing options for adults with Dravet in your area, again, there was a high degree of uncertainty, largely because, of course, a good third to a half of the respondents had younger patients, so they weren't forced to actually ask that question yet. And that's part of the goal of these webinars, is to get people to start thinking ahead, planning ahead as to what they need to do when, so that these transitions don't come upon them in too stressful of a time crunch. It's relevant to note that the parents in the oldest age group who've had the experience with the different housing options have about a 50-50 mix of satisfaction versus dissatisfaction. But with regards to what's going to happen outside of the home, the half that still are caring for their adult children within the home expressed a high degree of uncertainty about what comes next. So again, the theme that we hear time and again in the community today is that people are not sure of how to approach this transition or exactly what it holds for them and their child in the future. And that's why we brought together some experienced caregivers who have older patients to share some of their experiences with changes in programming and housing. So this was probably the most informative table that came out of the survey, and it asked the respondents to rate each of the following community housing options for the first 10 to 20 years after their child ages out of the public school supports. So we're talking about what type of housing situation would be an ideal fit, or on the other end, an unacceptable fit for your child in their early adulthood. And most of them felt that their current living arrangements with the parents were the better fit, which is not surprising because, of course, those with Dravet require a lot of care, and very few instances can people outside of a family unit care for and protect our children as well as we can. So that wasn't very surprising. With regards to how that living arrangement is set up, there was also a strong positive sentiment towards thinking about coming into closer contact with other families who have a Dravet member of their household. So this would be perhaps a neighborhood where 4 or more families in a group of 20 or 100 might actually have a Dravet patient. By having people in close proximity who have shared experiences or have empathy because of those shared experiences seem to be positively viewed by a number of respondents. With regards to thinking about how that neighborhood could be set up, there were several options in terms of single family living or multifamily living homes. But again, the preference seems to be that very similar to what you find throughout the United States, which is for single family living. With regards to group homes, so shifting out of the nuclear family into another situation where a non-family member would be providing the housing and primary care. This was viewed with mixed feelings. Some felt that it was a good fit, and a roughly equal number, maybe slightly less, felt that it was a poor fit. So again, this is kind of the middle ground where the group homes of adults, whether they be specifically geared towards the needs of Dravet patients or to include other adults with various disabilities, it was about the same. The only housing option that was viewed as poor fit or unacceptable was formal nursing home care. And that's perhaps a reflection of the better medical care that has come along in the last 10 years. We have better medications and treatments. We have more knowledge about how to work with these patients, and the high cost of nursing homes and the general dissatisfaction with that structure, perhaps because of some of the consequences of the pandemic, those were viewed fairly negatively in this survey. So it's not that this reflects the actual true fit. These are the opinions of the caregivers in 2022. When asked, where do you foresee your adult child living In the near term, in other words, 10 to 20 years from now, or the longer term, 20 to 40 years from now, what we could see is that, in fact, the shift from the parent's home being the primary location of care decreased with time. But still, about half of the community feels that their Dravet child will remain with them in the parent's home for as long as they live. This shift, though, towards other options is disproportionately to supervised group homes, and of course, the uncertainty and some unique situations and options that were expressed on an individual basis, but collectively were not reproduced well across this small sample size. Ultimately, when we look at all of the survey results and we ask about housing aspirations, most people, 77%, did not see their adult Dravet child living independently. But a small minority, about 15%, would like to see that happen, or were actually experiencing that and could respond positively to that being a worthwhile option. Similarly, a large majority saw that living with parents or guardians is the best fit, and 71% intended to keep their current living arrangements for the foreseeable future. And in the end, simple majorities responded positively to the idea of bringing Dravet families closer together in proximity, though only about half of those thought that a multi-unit complex would be a suitable living arrangement. So at this point, what we'd like to do is have Veronica introduce some of our more experienced caregivers, those who have Dravet patients who are older than 21 years, to tell a little bit about their experiences with housing as their childs became adult. And ahead of this webinar, we asked them to consider these questions and to speak to them during this time. So at this point, I'll turn it over to Veronica if she would like to introduce our panelists and get them to share their experiences.
Great. Thank you so much, Brian. So yeah, we'll start. We just have two panelists today that can kind of help us get the conversation going. Certainly, we want to hear from the rest of the audience members too. So after these panelists go, or if during you want to chime in and ask questions, please, this can be conversational. So first, I would like to introduce Kathy Dodd. Kathy, would you like to just tell us a little bit about your family and your daughter and sort of what living situation looks like now and plans for the future?
Sure. Thank you, Veronica, and thank you, Brian. The data that you showed was really, really interesting and helpful to kind of guide us in this discussion. My name is Kathy Dodd. My husband, Bob, and I have two girls. One who is Cameron, who is 26 and not living at home. She's our typical child. And then we have Stacy, who is 24. She does currently live with us. We live in one of the suburbs of the Chicago area. In the state of Illinois, individuals with disability qualify for educational entitlement until they turn age 22. So Stacy actually aged out of her kind of educational services right in the middle of the pandemic. Her birthday's in June. So in June of 2020 would have been when she actually turned 22. So she's been living with us at home for the last 24 years of her life. But she goes to a day program in our community. That's actually very close. That's where she spends most of her time. She likes to be out and about. So that's, how she's got a relatively busy schedule. She does a bunch of other things. And my husband, Bob, and I are really at a stage right now where our long-term, but more short-term plan, I would say in the next 2 to 3 years, our goal is to move Stacy out of our home into some sort of group home setting. And we are evaluating a number of options, which I can get into, as the dialogue goes on. But we really, the situation for Stacy, we think she really, really loves her. She loved her high school / transition experience, being out with her peers. She loves her day programming experience. at our place. That's the name of her day program. And so I think we just see her really enjoying spending time with her peers, spending time with others. When she's home, she's ready to kind of go somewhere. And so I think we feel for her and her personality, and what she'd want, that her moving into some sort of a residential setting outside of her home will be something that she will thrive in and enjoy, and hopefully also grow.
With regards to what you call her peers, I'm assuming it's people of similar age, but with a variety of disabilities. And so one of my questions is, have you, in that group, one, are there other Dravet patients or not? And secondly, have there been any particular interactions with people with certain types of different disabilities that were either particularly positive or unfortunately negative?
Yeah, so first of all, for us, in our local community, I mean, our community where she went to school, there are maybe only 1 or 2 families that I'm aware of that actually have a child with Dravet syndrome, her age. And so that maybe that's unique, but so, and both that I'm aware of are boys. And Stacy's a girl, so we want her to live in a girl home. So we haven't had really a whole lot of she hasn't had a whole lot of daily interaction with other young adults who have Dravet syndrome. So most of her, interaction with peers are, young adults that have autism, young adults who have Down syndrome, young adults that have other, maybe other issues, other disability kinds of issues. And we really haven't seen Stacy, we really haven't seen any negative effects. There's nobody that she hasn't appreciated, getting along with. So for us, I think, as we look at residential options, I think we have to we have to look outside the Dravet community, because there's just not a community. We don't have a network here for us to look into. And the second thing I would just say is, there is a broader network of families in the Chicagoland area. I actually wish Janice, I don't believe she's on the call today, Janice Stanley, who I know has been involved in some of these. She does live outside the Chicago area, but she doesn't live that close to us. And I think for us, keeping Stacy somewhat in the community that she's familiar with and living with and near us, as well as the rest of our family, our daughter, and then my husband has 2 other kids, is important to us. So proximity is a factor that we are looking at as we evaluate a residential setting.
I think that's actually a very important point to make. And I think it's one that I can echo, at least from our experience too, with the high school age, knowing that they are slow to ask questions and to get oriented to different environments. I think that at least for us, and maybe for you too, and others, that, the comfort of the known keeps people close to home. And it also keeps their search for housing options relatively close to the environment that they've grown up with. And so I think that it probably would be interesting to hear from those who may have had to move and change environments to see how well that's worked out. And I don't know if anyone on this call fits into that mold or not, but that also, is something that is an unknown for the community, which is how well can people adapt to those changes.
Right. Yeah, I just to add on that, I mean, community is really important to Stacy. And so, she goes to 2 different day programs. And so where she's already feels welcome, feels loved, feels understood. And so our search for residential options are going to be within one of those 2 communities.
Okay, very good. All right. Are there any questions for Kathy at this point or from the group?
I had a quick question if no one else does. I was just curious, sort of, as you're looking through the options, I know you've talked a little bit about, the things you've prioritized, which is what Stacy enjoys, socialization with peers. And kind of staying in the same community. But what are some of the other things that, as you look at potential, this 2 to 3 year plan for a residential setting, are there certain challenges that you're coming up against at different facilities, and what other things are you prioritizing in that process?
So that's a great question. And I'm going to speak to that. And then Colleen, who's another one of the panelists I know, will have a great perspective on that too. And I've learned a lot from her. So I think the biggest thing we're struggling with is, do we want a residential setting that's managed by a group of parents? Or do we want a residential setting that's managed by, I don't want to say an agency, but, so we're evaluating, there's a large residential area called Misericordia in the Chicago area, very well known and respected really throughout the area and potentially as other parts of the country. It's a large, almost like I want to say a college campus. There's 500 young adults with disabilities of all ranges that live there. It's like a full, and if Stacy were to live there, she would be in a home with probably 8 to 10 other women. She might not share her room. She might not have her own bedroom, but they will, but they will manage everything. So if staff is sick, they'll have another staff there. We're really, I don't want to say we're giving over control. What they like to say is we're really kind of sharing our daughter with them. Whereas the other options that we're evaluating are more, there's a number of families in our community that are also looking to kind of start their own group home. And that group home likely will be, purchased by a group of parents and will be managed by a group of parents. And so if your child is sick and can't go to their day program, then you're going to be responsible for kind of going and helping them, maybe bringing them home. If when the particular caregiver who's in the house manager is a better word, is maybe on vacation, then Stacy would come home for a week or whatever. And so I think that's where we're struggling with that. And I think ultimately concerned about the sustainability of a model where we're really kind of, I don't want to say engaged in the day-to-day things, but to some degree, for sure engaged in kind of, we'd be taking her even if she had to see a dentist or, anything, we'd be managing, there'd just be lots of things we'd be managing. And I think when we think about that longer term, that has some issues for us. And then if something happens to my husband or I, are we expecting our kids to take over on that? And so I would say for us, that's a really important issue for parents to be thinking about is, are you comfortable with kind of a loss of control? Or if you have more control, you need to understand the sustainability of that model. And I would love to hear what Colleen's going to say about that.
Thank you so much, Kathy. I'm sorry, Brian, did you have follow-up?
I was going to ask one quick follow-up question there, Kathy, was has your child stayed overnight anywhere else outside of the home before? And if so, how did that go?
So yes, we have had Stacy stay overnight. She's gone to sleepaway camps. Those have been like 5 to 6 days. And it's gone fine. She's, and we've had her do that multiple times. Again, those have generally been in settings where she knows it's been through like our special rec association where she at least is somewhat familiar with people. If we have her move into the setting where one of them I mentioned that's that is a larger setting, our plan is for her to kind of start by going for dinner and then having overnight, then she'll go for the weekend, and then she'll stay for a week. So we definitely recognize that we will need her to have some transition to kind of understand that we're moving her into a residential setting. I think right now she understands when she's going to camp, but that she's coming home. But yeah, she's been fine with overnights.
Great. Thank you.
All right, should we now hear from Colleen? And thank you so much, Colleen Penwell, for being here last week as a panelist, or 2 weeks ago, and where we were focusing much more on sort of what day-to-day life looks like. And so we'd love today to hear more about sort of the choices that your family has made around housing for your daughter and what that looks like.
Sure. Thank you. Thanks for all the hard work on this topic. It's very important, and for everybody gathering. So I'm Colleen Penwell. I live in Madison, Wisconsin. Well, actually Verona, which is a western suburb. My husband David and I have 3 kids. Our oldest, so much of this marries Kathy's story. It's kind of funny. Our oldest is 26 and she is employed and lives in Pennsylvania. And then our middle daughter, Grace, is 24 and a half. And she has Dravet. And so we'll talk about her whole situation in a bit. And then we have our youngest son is a senior in college, and he lives at Xavier, which is in Cincinnati. So the siblings are not in town. And Grace was diagnosed with Dravet later. She was age 12. And I'll sort of jump ahead to where we are today. So we, as she was in high school and in the transition program, which kind of mirrors what Kathy described as well. So I won't get into too much detail with that. But when, she aged out after 21 into the adult system. And so during that time, we really started to think about what her life would look like in terms of filling her days. And then also, as our other kids were not away, we really started to think about, okay, what are our options on where Grace could live. And we felt like it was a priority for her based on her personality. I would say developmentally, she's about 5 or 6. She's verbal, she's very social. And we felt like for our family, all the, components of our family, that her moving out of our house was a good fit for our family to progress. And so we did a lot of legwork and went to some different kind of workshops that were offered through some nonprofits in the Madison area. One called Moving On. I can never remember it correctly. And it really took us through the various living options from that basically were outlined in the survey that Brian highlighted, from adult family homes. And that was one that wasn't discussed as much, but adult family homes, group homes, completely independent living, options for if your child stays at home. And along that same time, we knew that we kind of were leaning towards having her live away from our house. We also were given guidance on starting to kind of wet the palate a little bit on having more services brought into our house, care providers, peer mentors, people who would take on different kinds of roles should she no longer be in our house. After we finished that, we also started the process of aligning with some other families, some parents in our area who also had adult daughters who were starting to dip their toe into like, what could this look like? We looked at several different models that other families were involved in and kind of honed in on what we ideally wanted. And I can talk about that a little bit. And also the fact that now fast forward 3 years, it's not what we originally thought it was going to be, for lots of different reasons. So I can talk about that, or if you want me to focus on something else specifically, I can do that as well.
I think that actually highlighting what you expected and then what it's turned out to be would be very informative.
Mm-hmm. And just a couple minor points that I think are worth sort of at least noting somewhere as we progress, because I think the survey and everything was so great. A couple things stood out to me that I think are noteworthy, that it would be interesting to peel out some of the demographics in terms of the age of the the child, the parents of that child. Because, for example, had you asked me those questions when Grace was in middle school or even early high school, I would have said, there's no way she can ever live away from here. And it's important to keep in mind the possibility that is very great with Dravet, that the way Dravet will present in adulthood versus as a child or preteen is dramatically different. Like Grace's entire presentation of Dravet is completely a 180 of what it was when she was younger. So based on that, it really did impact some of our decision making and our priorities and things like that. So that's just kind of one point. The other thing that there's been a lot of great discussion about, sort of the idea of finding other Dravet families, which of course is great. Again, kind of to mirror what Kathy said, we don't have this big population of Dravet folks, and I don't want other families with younger kids to be scared of that, because, for example, what we've learned during this journey is that whether it's Dravet or another significant or rare disability, some of those same kind of needs, while they're different, mirror each other. And so that's what we've found with some of the families we've aligned with for creating a living situation for Grace. So those are just a couple of notes. So where we started, and it's hard to just kind of shrink down years of effort and stuff into 5 minutes. So what I hope, please chime in and kind of redirect me if I'm going down the wrong tangent. This group of families got together through a Facebook group called Love Inc., LOV. And there were a group of parents that came together, and a huge takeaway, if you end up going down the route that Kathy kind of talked about and what we're doing, is aligning with other families. Everybody I've talked to has said the same thing. At the end of the day, it ends up being as much about the parents and a marriage of the parents than the girls. In our case, we have daughters. So, for example, a group of parents started to meet, and we met every week via Zoom because it was during COVID, for over 6 months, maybe close to a year, before our daughters ever met. Because it was just slicing and dicing so much information. And we ended up with 5 families that were kind of having these weekly meetings. 3 of those families ended up not even being in the group that ended up living together. So I just share that because it's like, that world of grand plans. And
so that was part of that transition. You thought that it would be this 5 group of people, and now 3 years later, well, 2 of them, yeah, but there's also so-and-so additions to that.
And I really think it was a situation where, as we started to have these really great and hard conversations. So again, another takeaway is time. This is not for the faint of heart. This is time intensive, and you're doing the hard work now, so that in 5 or 10 or 20 years, you and your other kids and, we might be able to alleviate some things that would come later. So what actually happened with a couple of the other families is they realized, this is not right for us. This isn't a right model. They actually ended up moving away from Madison to be closer to some of their other kids, to have more of a family close by. So we started these groups of these 5 families started really doing a lot of legwork. Some of us had done that seminar that I talked about, the Moving On, but we really started to visit other models. So adult homes, apartments, all different things. And we were familiar with a group that had a model that we really, really liked. And I talked to Kathy a lot about this too. And this is the model that we initially thought, okay, this is what we want to do. However, it was tricky with COVID. So there were a group of parents that created an LLC. And there were 3 gentlemen, 3 young men, and so 3 families. And the house purchased the LLC, excuse me, purchased this house. So basically these three families bought this house. And then they also created a 501c3, a nonprofit. Two of these folks are lawyers. So it also helps too when you have people who have skill sets or you can find them.
Right.
And so keep in mind, when I was learning this, it was like, wait, what? They created a 501c3, and they rent the house. The 501c3 rents the house from the LLC. And so it's just a way to have some protection for the groups. And so they bought a house in downtown Middleton, which is a super cute town. Everything's walkable. And they did a ton of work to this house and created 3 en-suites for the young men. Now, I'll also add that these gentlemen, I would say, are definitely higher functioning. I would say like developmentally more like 15-ish. So just, compared to our daughter, but we were all really intrigued by the idea. And they created, sort of within this big old house, kind of ensuite. So everybody had their own bedroom and bathroom and some shared community spaces. And then they did do a small addition on the side of the house, and they created almost like an efficiency apartment for what they called their housing mentor. And so this is a guy who lives there, and it just kind of provides that support. Now, again, a big caveat, none of these guys in particular have significant fragile medical situations. So I'm acknowledging all of that. And so anyway, you can see there's this umbrella of the families managing all of that. They create all of the support, find the supports and all that is needed. And then they have this housing mentor. So our group kind of really was interested in that and set out to try to find a house, which, my background is we own some rental properties. And so like people joke, I'll buy anything and make it good. There was nothing to be had that we felt like we could turn into what we wanted. Plus, we just couldn't square with how this model would work with some of the medical needs, behavioral needs, all of that with some of our girls. So this conversation then started where the Penwells also we have a little 4-plex apartment building in another great area of Madison. And so it's 4 2-bedroom apartments. And so now we're probably 1.5 years into this process. And the group has kind of gone full circle. And we started to realize, maybe this model would work, kind of a hybrid. And so I'll fast forward. A year ago, August, we, the Penwells, we turned over the building and did a bunch of work on the building. And the 4 apartments are now housing, there used to be 7, now there's 6 adult women with disabilities. And our model that took another, 1.5 years, it's just within the last month actually happening. And so I say that because another huge takeaway, this is not for the faint of heart. I mean, it's a lot of legwork. So our model is kind of a hybrid of what Kathy was talking about wanting to do. So we have a parent group that's very involved. We, the Penwells, felt strongly that we did not want to give up ownership of the building. So we still own it. Then there's the group of parents that are very involved. And then our goal was to find an agency. And that's the part that was just hellacious. And we finally have done it. And it's starting for the last 2 months and it's gone great. So an agency who is managing all of the various supports that the different women need. And so I would say, just to give you an idea of the range, there is one young woman who is medically fragile, has basically one-on-one support. And then there's Grace, who has Dravet, all the way up to developmentally, I would say somebody who's about 13, 14. So there's 6 women currently. Grace, my daughter, has her own apartment. And I can talk about why that is because of some security people that we have come into the building and actually use her second bedroom. And then the other really fragile young woman has somebody with her. And then the other 2 apartments have 2 women. And so the agency manages the different support people that are needed. And that's where we are today.
So what this is great, because what it points out is several challenges and issues to making a group home work outside. First and foremost is finding the people you're going to go in with, whether it's an established agency or something that starts from the grassroots. Second thing is the property itself and how it meets the needs and challenges of the individuals that are going to be there, which again, even if it were just all Dravet, it's the same thing. You know, we've got a range of capacities and independence there, but there's no doubt that there's need for some degree of supervision. And so then that third big challenge is, how does that get organized and operated and managed? Because whether it's through an established agency or an employee of your own homegrown 501(c), it's all people driven. And the parents have to be comfortable with that degree of supervision and management, because many of the adults with Dravet still have nightly seizures. It may happen once a year, it may happen once a night. And how is that dealt with? And that's something that, again, is part of why we're having this conversation, is to get people to think about what are these relevant issues. And you've brought those 3 front and center. So thank you.
And I'd add that, you know, I think it's just that idea of really focusing on what's the solution. Because like for us, each parent, each family had, we called them, what are your deal breakers? And, you know, for us, I talked earlier about how Grace's Dravet syndrome has dramatically changed in adulthood. So Grace went from, you know, massive seizures in the middle of the day constantly to around age 16, she only has seizures at night. So she fits that, you know, kind of silo of adults who transition in what their seizures look like. So for us, like, how do we manage that? What is the solution? I could never have her be alone having seizures, you know, but we can't have, you know, for her, it didn't work to have like a paid care provider there based on her budget stuff. So we ended up coming up with a solution that was, you know, scary, but we now feel good about in terms of how to make sure somebody is available to her for that.
Right.
Can I just add something to that? Just what Colleen was saying, which we haven't addressed because this is a broad topic, you know, but as parents are going through this, it's really important to understand the state funding and eligibility and the programs you qualify for. And, you know, that's gonna also dictate how much you can do, or where you might land, you know, and so, you know, that's not the topic for today. And, you know, Colleen and I have talked about just the differences in Illinois versus Wisconsin and things like that. But I wouldn't want us to not at least address that an important component is understanding, you know, what services and financial support you'll get from the state as you evaluate your options.
And that's a great plug for the November 15th webinar. Thank you.
Okay. Wasn't even, but.
So excellent. There was one question that came in that's related to all of this, and either one of you can speak to this before we move on to our third panelist, which is that for those who do have medical needs, and sometimes it's just as simple as we have the seizures overnight typically, so we don't have to worry about it, but then she gets the flu or a cold and can't deal with that.
Right.
Have you had any problems or challenges with your external caregivers in being able to provide the type of support that you would feel comfortable with? Or again, is that...
Sorry, my computer is going to die, so I'm going to plug in, but we literally are dealing with it at this moment because Grace got really sick. And actually, in some ways, I'm sort of glad this is happening because it's we're able to figure this out. So she has come down with a really bad cold. And so, so that it was this, okay, well, she can't go to work. Okay, well, are there care providers there? Because so many of the women work. So we're working right now on more specific written protocols for the agency. It's called Angels at Home. They're the ones who provide support. But, they're in charge of, if I was gone, for example, they are the emergency backup. They are the ones who will, care for her, and they've gotten to know her. And so in terms of having peace of mind, to know that there's somebody else there to be able to care for her and start to understand this is more than a cold, or we have to call somebody else if I was gone. I think it's a really important thing. And I know it just gives huge peace of mind to my other kids, knowing that there's, we have family friends and everything that will do that kind of thing. But I don't know, this having an agency and support people there helps a lot.
Right.
Well, and the other thing I'd just say to that we're struggling with as we evaluate various options for our daughter, Stacy, is Stacy also only has seizures at night. And so what we're deciding is, we know we need care at night. The question is, do we need awake care at night? Because that does define a different level of care, whether you have somebody in the home that's just basically listening for a seizure, or where you have somebody who's awake, who then, and that's something that we're still balanced, trying to decide what we think is going to be the best thing. I mean, we listen to a monitor at night, so we sleep, obviously. That's how we hear our daughter Stacy's seizures, but we're used to it. And so how would we feel if somebody else was sleeping and didn't hear it, and knock on wood, something happened? I mean, it's just so so just that's another important part of I thought what Colleen said was so helpful, which is, what are your deal breakers? And make sure you know what those are before you start this. And that if that's that you need 24-hour care, or you only need nighttime care because your child's going to be in a day program during the day, or whatever that possibly can be, I think those are really, really important things for you and your family to iron out during this process. And then the only other thing I'd say is just, and this came up a couple times in the Dravet conference, is just, as much as this is a decision for you and your husband, or you and your significant other, or whatever, encourage you to include your other family members who, depending on what decision you have, something happens to you and they're the bearer of the decisions you've made.
Yep.
That's huge. I mean, really, that was our driver in everything that we did. It would have been easier, frankly, to keep her, to greet Grace at home. Because this has been like the most challenging, let's face it, as parents with a child with a disability, this is not our first rodeo. I mean, this is like, I know we've all felt like some days we're lucky if we get through the day. But this moving thing and creating this structure has, like, I'm not kidding, it's not for the faint of heart. But that said, now that we've been doing it for a year plus, I try to appreciate baby steps. And had I ever imagined that Grace would be doing some of the things that she's doing now, never. So, just, it's also easy to think of, again, I'm just going to use the night seizures it's a deal breaker, but what's the solution? Like, if you really cannot come up with a solution, okay, then maybe it is. But perhaps have the perspective of what are the deal breakers, but then how can we find a solution?
Right. At this point, I need to go back to finish up the conversation, because there's one last part here, and we're running a little bit short on time. So again, sorry for cutting you off, but wanting to allow those who are also on this call. We've got people who are coming in and listening and might have some questions, and they may have to do with again, the timing of the planning for these changes in housing arrangements. But if you also have specific concerns about making a change, feel free to voice them now, because what we want to make clear in this webinar is that these are a lot of questions that people have and uncertainties that until we begin to ask the questions and as a group try to find answers, here's an opportunity to talk to at least some people who are there that might have some answers to address those concerns. Whether it's about making a change or not making a change. And then also, if you've had some experience looking at alternative housing arrangements in your area, what have you found that might be similar to or different from what's been described so far? And then lastly, how do you feel about living in closer proximity with others with disabilities? And as was pointed out, it doesn't necessarily have to be a family who has someone with Dravet, but with one of those other disabilities that seems to get along well with your child. So if there are others who would like to speak up at this time, I think now would be a great time to do that. And this is, of course, the hard part, right, is to get people to speak up. Well, I know that one of the concerns that my wife and I have had is really around this issue of compatibility. In the multiple disabilities class that our child goes to, some of those kids have not only much greater verbal skills, but also bigger attitude problems and challenges for the aides. And there's a subset that are very meek, but we worry a lot about learning bad habits by being around, and was wondering if you had ever experienced that insecurity, or if you feel that that's probably just overzealous worrying. I'm a worrywart. I'm certified in that regard.
I'll comment. We used to worry about that exact same thing a lot, really all through the school years. And since Grace has been in the adult program, I almost feel like we've gone more the flip side. Maybe it's who we've ended up aligning with in terms of housing and all of that. But some of the diversity has been great in terms of the people who are at Grace's house. And then some of the folks that she interacts with work, I don't know. It's interesting. I can totally relate to what you're saying, because we felt that way a lot. And just as she has been coming more and having more presence in the adult system, it seems to have gone away. Maybe it's a credit to her. Maybe she is not as affected or something. I don't know.
It's good to hear. Thank you. Is there anyone else on this call that has some questions that are occurring to them right now? And knowing full well that oftentimes the questions seem to pop up an hour or 3 hours later, there is a Facebook page that for parents with Dravet children that the Dravet Syndrome Foundation operates. So you can obviously bring those questions there, and you'll find a welcoming community.
Yeah, we have both the main caregiver group, but there is also a split off group for caregivers to those 16 and up that are really starting to delve into these types of issues. And it's not always it's not as active as the main group, but when discussion does happen, it seems to go deep and be meaningful, and a lot of sharing, at least, from my experience with that group. So, if you're not already in that group and you're on Facebook, I would really encourage it, because it's a great place to continue these kinds of conversations.
Great. Okay, well then I'll just leave it again once more on the positive note that remember that wherever you are in the journey with Dravet, there is support available, and there's lots of people who care about the growth and well-being of your family. We hope that you'll join us again in November at 2 p.m. Central Time, where we will get into discussing the timelines for planning and managing the transitions for adults with Dravet syndrome. And we hope to find you on the web at that time. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Colleen, and Kathy had to drop off, but thank you to Kathy. Special thanks to Brian. We really appreciate everyone coming together to talk about these issues. We recorded this program today, so if you came in late, I'll reshare the recording with everyone, as well as share information on the last installment of this series. We hope to see you there again. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.